And welcome to the Carlin Cymru Psychology Catch-Up session. The session today is going to be presented by myself, Miss Bellis, and I teach psychology at the Allen School. The presentation and the resources that I talk about within this session will be available in the Carlin Cymru drop-down on the e-sgol website, along with a recording of this session. Okay, so this is our third session within this year's cohort of revision sessions. And we've already looked at some of our classic studies in psychology within Unit 1. So we looked at Rain and Bowlby, and then last week we looked at Loftus and Palmer and Watson and Rayner. Today we're moving away slightly from the classic studies, and actually we're going to look at an element within Unit 2, which is looking at your comparison of your approaches. Sorry, this is also within Unit 1. And this is an element of the course that can often be quite difficult and quite daunting for students. So I'm hoping that today I can help you tackle the questions and also help you understand what exactly the exam board are asking from you when a question like this comes up. So it says how to tackle comparison questions when looking at similarities and differences of two psychological approaches. So that is the aim of today. I hope that this is helpful. And like I said, lots of the resources that I'm going to be sharing with you will also be available on the website. Okay, so we are still within our Unit 1. And we are looking at our 5 different psychological approaches. So throughout Year 12, you will have focused on the biological approach, the psychodynamic approach, the behaviourist approach, the cognitive approach, and the positive approach. And you will have looked at lots and lots of elements within those approaches. So you look at the assumptions, you look at the formation of a relationship, you look at various different therapies, you look at studies. And a really big element of all of the approaches is an evaluation. So you should have evaluated your therapy, and you also will have evaluated the whole of the approach. And your comparison questions take an element of that evaluation. So it's definitely looking at an AO3 skill, as well as understanding your actual knowledge of the approach as a whole. So comparison of the approaches then, there's many different questions that you could be asked with this. I've chosen this one just because I have got some essay plans and some sample essays on it. However, there is lots of different combinations that this question could throw at you. So it reads on the screen, describe one similarity and one difference between the positive and biological approaches. Now, where it says positive and biological approaches, they could put any 2 approaches that you've got there. So there really is lots and lots of different suggestions and different specific questions that could be asked within this element. So it's really important that we have a knowledge and an understanding of the different areas that you can talk about for each approach, but also what do you say about them and how do you lay it out in an exam format. Other questions that could be asked for this is, sometimes they've said, you know, a psychology teacher thinks that the biological approach is better than the psychodynamic approach because it's scientific. Why are they correct? And that question would be steering you more towards looking at the scientific elements of both of the approaches and seeing whether you agree or disagree with that statement and bringing in some evidence that would support what the question is asking from you. Sometimes they can be, you know, a variety of worth a variety of different marks. However, today we are going to answer it as if it is a 12-mark question, because quite often they are. And we want to make sure that with the higher mark questions, we are comfortable in getting every single mark. This is where we're focusing on today. One similarity and one difference between positive and biological approaches. This is your mark scheme. So it's quite thorough in what it is asking from you. So we'll go from the bottom, 0 marks, inappropriate answer given. So that would be given if there was no attempt at the question or if there was just a couple of words. If you weren't really saying much or you panicked and you just wrote a sentence or you ran out of time, you would receive 0 marks. Our second mark band, 1 to 3 marks, says a superficial analysis is made of the similarities and differences of the approaches with no reference to the context of the question. So superficial analysis would be that maybe some of the similarities and differences that you're making are incorrect or they seem quite sort of made up. No reference to the context of the question. So no actual reference to those different approaches. So no evidence from the biological approach, or you're not demonstrating your knowledge of the positive approach. Where appropriate, no reference are made to the quotation. So again, you haven't really answered the question. You're kind of just stating things that you believe. Lack of depth and range. Lack of examples, and examples are really, really important in this, and I'll go on to that later on. That it lacks structure, so maybe it's a little bit jumbled up, maybe you jump from one thing to another and it doesn't read in a logical way. No conclusion. So with a comparison question, you must conclude your answer. If there is no conclusion or it's very basic, you're really limiting yourself to just the bottom of that mark scheme, which is not what we want, is it? We want to be right up here in our 10 to 12 marks. So that's something to be really, really cautious of. We definitely need to make sure we've got a really strong conclusion. For 4 to 6 marks, it gets a little bit more in detail, okay? So 6 marks is obviously half of what the question's worth. So it's saying that you will have a basic analysis is made of the similarities and differences of the approach and the context of the question, or a good analysis is made of the similarities with no reference to the context of the question. So we've got a little bit of information there. We've linked it to the context of the question. We've linked it to the biological and positive approaches. Depth and range, depth or range shown. So I've spoken a little bit more about depth. Depth is the amount of detail that you have about something. How much have you told the examiner that you know about that certain approach? And range is lots of different areas or topics within that approach that you've covered in your answer. So for half marks or just below half marks, depth or range, you wouldn't have to have both. Examples to support points. Structure is reasonable and a basic conclusion is reached. So even just to get 4 to 6 marks, you must have some examples in there. Now, examples in this case, it's your psychology. It's your pieces of evidence that you've learned throughout looking at all of these approaches. Okay, moving up then, this is sort of where we want to be. 7 to 9 marks. A good analysis is made of the similarities and differences in context of the question. Where appropriate, some references are made to the quotation, some depth and range, examples to support points made are appropriate. So we need to make sure we've got a really good example and that really is backing up what you're trying to get across to the examiner. Structure is mostly logical, so it reads quite nicely. You've put connective sentences in, you've made it clear which approach you're talking about and which one you're going to move on to talk about. And then a reasonable conclusion is reached based on the evidence presented. So you've written a really nice conclusion and it really does sum up the points that you've made in your actual essay. And then right at the top mark band then, 10 to 12 marks. A thorough analysis is made of the similarities and differences of the approaches in the context of the question. One of the key things there is thorough. Thorough means you've really spoken in detail about something, you've added some evidence in, and you've really shown the examiner the key terminology that you know about that approach. Where appropriate, key references are made to the quotation. Depth and range is displayed, so we've got into detail, but we've also spoken about lots of elements of the approach. Examples to support the points made are really well chosen. Structure is logical and an appropriate conclusion is reached based on evidence. So that's what we're aiming for, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples today about what makes a good question, what makes a good answer, and hopefully you'll be able to identify the key points that have really gained somebody, you know, right at the top of that mark band. All right, there's lots and lots of different elements that you can talk about within the similarities and the differences of the approach. The main thing is to think about some of the elements that you evaluate when you evaluate a whole approach. So, for example, here's a list on the screen of different things that you can discuss because they have either one or the other, and lots of the approaches fall to either one or the other side of an argument here. So we've got NVN is nature versus nurture. Most of the time, your approaches will fall one side or the other. Are they nature? Do they believe in biology, in genes, in genetics, in your behaviour driven from your brain or chemicals, neurotransmitters? Or are they more nurture? Do they believe that it's to do with upbringing or learning from your environment? Or is it things around you that impact your behaviour? Okay, most of them are one or the other. Okay, some of them try and have elements that look at both, but nature versus nurture is a really, really nice similarity and difference to bring into your answer. The second one, reductionism, holism. Reductionism means that behaviour is reduced down and it only looks at a couple of elements. Holism means that it looks at lots of different aspects of a human in order to get a really broad, holistic view of their behaviour. Now, lots of our approaches are slightly more reductionist because they're quite specified in their view of behaviour. So, for example, the biological approach, it's reductionist because it believes, you know, all behaviour is driven by our genes and our genetics, but it doesn't consider any other aspects of a person, does it? Then we've got determinism versus free will. Determinism means that behaviour would be determined by something that is outside of your control. So again, for example, genetics, they're outside of our control. We can't really alter them. So determinism would definitely be within the biological approach. The opposite of determinism is free will. So free will means that we have the choice. We know what behaviour we're going to display, and we're given a little bit more control over it. So, for example, that one would be the positive approach, wouldn't it? We have control over our thoughts and our feelings and how we deal with them. So determinism versus free will actually works quite well for the question that we're going to answer. Second one, methods used to study the behaviour. So what was the methodology? I've spoken a lot in the previous sessions about methodologies. What did they use? You know, was it a lab experiment? Was it controlled? Was it an observation study? Did they use self-report methods? They're all things that you can bring into similarities and differences. The next one is whether it's scientific or not. Has it got a controlled variable? Has it used empirical evidence to back up the theory? Is there use of a PET scan? Are the methods that they use objective or are they more subjective? Are they open to interpretation, maybe from a therapist? Evidence for basic assumptions. What's the evidence? Okay, what's the evidence suggesting? Use of humans versus animals. Which one do they test on? Okay, do they do their theory on an animal and then apply it or generalize it to a human? Or do they do it on a human and don't really look at animal behaviour? Effectiveness of applications. So that means that maybe our treatment or our therapy that we've looked at, does that actually apply? Does it have a practical application in the real world? Okay, have people used it before to look at mental illness or to look at murderers, or they used it in a courtroom setting? The therapies and the treatments, okay, how are they different? Are they similar in any way? Are they scientific? Do they focus on cognitive processing? Ethics. Ethics is a really big one that you could bring into this. So when we're looking at the studies within the approach, well, what was ethically wrong about one? Was one ethically worse than the other? Did they both have valid consent? Did one have valid consent, but the other one actually deceived them? They're all areas within these similarities and differences. And then the last bit is the consideration of individual differences. Do many of them do that? Do they consider that different people are going to react in a different way to something? Or do they believe that behaviour is more universal? They're all little elements of debate, essentially, aren't they, that you can bring into a similarities or differences question or a compare and contrast question. Okay, so looking at some typical research methods, and again, this is something that you could bring into this. So for the cognitive approach, it's mainly an experiment, isn't it? It's Loftus and Palmer's research, looking at the effect of leading questions on eyewitness testimony. She uses an experiment. She uses two different types. She has really, really high controls. They watch video clips and they answer questions, or they give a prediction of a speed. That's also similar in the biological approach. So Rain's experiment, he did brain scans on murderers, okay, used a PET scan, 10 horizontal slices using a peel and box technique, okay, really, really scientific and objective in the way that they are looking at things. However, within the psychodynamic approach, it was more sort of case studies. Freud liked to get a case study about an infant or a person and analyse their behaviour that way. And also, Bowlby used case studies and self-report method from the children and the mothers about their upbringing. So slightly less scientific because maybe there's more qualitative than quantitative data. That's the same within the positive approach. Your idea of subjective well-being and your views of happiness, they are all done via a self-report. It's a questionnaire, isn't it? They use that. How satisfied are you with life? Not very, or yes, I am. It's all self-report method. And what you should be thinking is it's open to demand characteristics. It's open to social desirability, which makes it less scientific. And then lastly, the behaviourist approach. The behaviourist approach looked at, Watson and Rayner and the Little Albert study. So you could talk about how they looked at this controlled observation, different elements, different variables, and they observed the behaviour Albert displayed. You could also look at Pavlov's dogs and the fact that it was a experiment looking at something completely different, and they stumbled across knowing that somebody can associate a stimulus with a response if they're paired together enough times. It's the same with the Skinner box and looking at reinforcement. Okay, again, if they give them positive reinforcement, so if you give a rat a pellet of food, they're going to continue to press that lever. So there is lots and lots of things and elements that you can actually discuss within this. It is quite a brief essay outline on how I would set out this question. So it says, brief intro to the two approaches. Tell me what you know, okay? Keyword there is brief. You don't need to go on and on and on about what you know about this, because we need to get to the similarities and the differences before that. So a brief introduction. What are the main principles? What's their main belief about human behaviour? And then start to discuss 1 to 2 similarities. What is there? What's similar? Okay. Do they both look at nature, or do they both look at nurture? Are they both scientific? Are they both subjective? Then discuss 2 to 3 differences. So what are the differences? Is one of them deterministic? Is one of them looking at free will? Is one of them more holistic? Is one of them reductionist? Okay, so using the things from the previous list on the previous slide to try and identify similarities and differences. And like I said, discuss 2 of them. Evidence and examples to illustrate the similarity, or the difference. So that's when you bring in your psychology here, okay? Your knowledge and your understanding of the approach to really show off what you know. Then a conclusion. Sum up the main similarity and difference. Are they more similar or are they more different? Come to a conclusion, okay? Should they work together to form a holistic view of behaviour? Now, the bottom point is really important. If there is a quote in the question, refer to it throughout your answer. So sometimes it can say, like I said before, a psychology teacher explains that the biological approach is more scientific. Well, make sure that you reference that psychology teacher, okay? Reference it throughout and also put it in your conclusion as well, because it will just show the examiner that you've really read the question and that you understand what you're being asked to do. So there is a brief essay outline. And again, top mark band, that 10 to 12 marks, that's what we're aiming for here. Thorough analysis is made of the similarities and the differences of the approaches in the context of the question. Clear references to the quotation where relevant. Examples to support the points made are very well chosen. Breadth and depth shown. Structure is logical throughout, and we've got that conclusion as well. So that is what we're aiming for in our answer. Okay, let's have a little look then at how we could start planning an answer, because I think it would be quite difficult to go straight into writing this. We need to have a bit of a think about where we're going to pitch our sort of points. So here we have a essay plan, and it follows, where's the sheet? Let me show you. It follows this sheet, okay, which looks at similarities and differences. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this is available to you all in case you want to have a go at using it to plan an answer. So if we go back to this one that's already been filled out, questions asking you to describe one similarity and one difference between the positive and biological approaches. Okay, so the key assumption of the biological approach is that all behaviour can be explained in terms of the biological systems, such as the brain and neurotransmitters, and in terms of evolution and genetics. Lovely, that's an overview of the biological approach. It shows the examiner, tick, they know what they're talking about. In contrast, the positive approach explains behaviour in terms of individual qualities and skills, and claims that we can enhance our lives by recognising and developing our strengths and virtues. And again, a really, really nice small overview of that positive approach. Okay, looking then at our similarity, I'm just going to turn my light on, so I'm losing a light here. First, at our first similarity. So, something that they have identified is a similarity between these approaches is that they both have useful applications that can be used to improve people's lives. Lovely. That's our point. Next thing then is an explanation, okay, why? So it says, the biological approach has led to many forms of treatment for mental disorders, such as drug therapy and psychosurgery. These therapies have been used to treat a range of disorders, including OCD, bipolar disorder, and depression. Lovely, a little bit more of an explanation as to why it has useful application. Then a little bit of evidence, and this is where your nice little bit of psychology comes in. So they've got a bit of research here. For example, Cosgrove and Rauch reported recovery rates of 67% of OCD through treatment with a form of psychosurgery, or bipolar has been successfully treated with drug therapy. Figueroa et al. Reported that more than 60% of bipolar patients improve when treated with the drug lithium. So that tells us that drug therapy really works. It has a positive application. Really, really nice point there. It doesn't go into tons of detail where it gets a bit lost and it's a little bit jumbled. It really has a clear explanation and a clear piece of evidence as well. Then looking at the positive approach, similarity. The positive psychology has been applied to a range of different settings, such as schools, the armed forces, and the workplace, in order to help individuals, organisations, and communities to flourish. In education, the positive psychology curriculum has been introduced to many schools in the USA to increase well-being, improve behaviour, and reduce stress in students. Lovely. So the practical applications of positive psychology. A little bit of evidence down here. For example, Gillam et al. Reported on the Penn Resiliency Programme, which was introduced to students and resulted in reduced symptoms of depression. After 24 months, only 22% of the experimental group, compared to 44% of the control group, showed symptoms of depression. Further research by Seligman found that parents and teachers of students randomly assigned to PPC class reported that they were more cooperative and had better social skill. So again, a really nice chunk of evidence to back up that explanation. That would be enough for your similarity. One similarity, explanation from each approach, evidence from each approach. Next one, the difference. Okay, so they've had a look at their list and they've thought, right, what are the main differences now between the biological and the positive one? The major difference between the two approaches is that they are on opposing sides of the determinism versus free will debate. Lovely, really straight to the point. The biological approach supports the determinism side of the debate, claiming that our behaviour is controlled by our biology, such as our genes, brain and neurotransmitters, hence claiming that we have little control over our lives. So they've got a little bit of support there for that determinism. For example, research has shown the localization of brain functions by certain areas of the brain are responsible for different functions. Brain scans have shown that certain areas of the brain are more active in patients with OCD. The research suggests that OCD is caused by activity in these areas of the brain, a deterministic explanation. So again, really nice piece of evidence to back it up and why it's deterministic. On the other side then, in contrast, and that, you know, when we talk about a logical structure in the mark scheme, things like, for example, in contrast, on the other hand, okay, similarly, all of those words really make it sort of read well, and they sort of enhance the logical structure of your essay. So it says, in contrast, the positive approach proposes the idea of free will, claiming that humans are self-regulating and are not victims of their biology or their past. It states that we are free to choose how we live our lives and have the power to change what we're not happy with. Again, some more evidence. In the positive approach, quality of life therapy is based on free will and the belief that we can improve the quality of our own lives. It's achieved by identifying problem areas, planning interventions, and assessing the effects of these interventions. And then they've got a piece of research, okay? So they've really gone into detail and explained there the evidence, and they've linked it back to the question with this sentence here. This supports the idea of us having free will to change our lives. And that's a really nice, again, for logical structure, it's really nice for you to make your point, state your evidence, and bring it back to the question, or bring it back to the point you're originally making. Now, there's a conclusion on this, which is wonderful, because we know that in order to get right at that top mark band, we've got to have a really appropriate conclusion. So they've written, in conclusion, the biological and positive approaches have some things in common, such as their ability to provide therapies that can be used to treat a range of disorders or to improve people's lives. However, the methods that they use to do this are significantly different in terms of how scientific and invasive they are. This difference, along with the fundamental difference between them in terms of where they stand on the determinism versus free will debate, leads me to conclude that there are far more differences between the approaches than similarities. So they've really summed up their points, and they've said they're very different. They're way too different from each other, and they've come to a decision at the end. Okay, so I'm hoping that this isn't too overwhelming to look at, really, because I know it's a lot of writing, but I'm hoping that you can see the level of depth that you need to go into when you're looking at this question. Okay, so we've got our similarity, our difference, and our evidence either side, and then a nice conclusion and a lovely introduction to start with. Okay, so let's now have a look at a really good exam answer. This again, looking at, this is now the biological and the behaviourist approach. So I'm going to read you this one, which spans over 2 pages, and then I'm going to read you a weaker answer, and hopefully we can start to identify what is the difference between the two. Where are the marks gained? Okay, can you clearly see one of them is better than the other? Says here, the main assumption of the biological approach is that behaviour can be explained in terms of biological systems. In contrast, the behaviourist approach proposes that all behaviour is learned from the environment. Lovely little intro about both of them. Therefore, one of the main differences between the approaches is in terms of the nature versus nurture debate. The biological approach supports the nature side, claiming that all behaviour is controlled by biological factors such as the brain, neurotransmitters, and genes. For instance, biological research has shown that the neurotransmitter dopamine has been linked with the mental disorder of schizophrenia. The evidence comes from a number of sources. For example, the drug amphetamine is known to increase levels of dopamine, and the large doses of the drug can cause some symptoms associated with schizophrenia. Lovely bit of evidence there. In contrast, again, they've got those connective words in to make the structure really clear. The behaviourist approach claims that we are born blank slates, and all behaviour we develop is a result of an interaction with our environment, i.e. nurture. For example, this is where they're bringing in their evidence. Watson and Rayner carried out a study where they developed a phobia of previously unfeared white rats in a young child by creating conditions where they paired the rat with an unpleasant experience, a loud noise. So they're showing their knowledge here now, they're bringing in their knowledge of Watson and Rayner, so that the child learned to associate the two events and eventually respond to the rat in the same way as the unpleasant experience, i.e. with fear. The similarity between the two approaches is that they both have useful applications for treating disorders and improving people's lives. For example, the biological approach has led to many forms of treatment for mental disorder, such as drug therapy and psychosurgery. So we've got our difference, and now we're moving on to our similarity. They've both got a useful application. Brain scans have shown that certain areas of the brain are more active than others in patients with OCD. Again, this is similar to the previous plan. They're talking about forms of psychosurgery, therefore designed to sever these areas in order to reduce the symptoms of OCD. Sherrick et al. Showed that males with conduct disorder and criminal behaviour had reduced levels of anxiety, of aggression and impulsivity after a 21-day course of an SSRI antidepressant compared to a control group taking placebos. Again, really, really strong piece of evidence to support the practical application of the treatment. From the behaviourist approach, the useful applications include systematic desensitization, which is a technique based on classical conditioning that is used to change negative behaviour such as phobias. Good, because we're showing the examiner our knowledge. It involves the client learning an alternative response to a negative behaviour. For example, Capathons found that clients with a fear of flying showed less physiological signs of fear and reported lower levels of fear after a 12 to 25 week treatment period of SD. Nice, again, another piece of research added in there. Now we're looking at the conclusion. It says, in conclusion, although the biological and behaviourist approaches both have useful applications for helping to treat psychological disorders, these treatments are very different in nature and are based on two very different beliefs about the causes of behaviour. This is backed up by the fact that they stand on opposing sides of the nature-nurture debate. Based on this, I would argue that the approaches are far more different than they are similar. So they've come to, again, a really lovely conclusion. Okay, let's now have a look at a bit of a weaker answer. Okay, hopefully you'll be able to see why this answer is weaker. So this is it. This is the whole answer. A similarity, so again, now we're looking at positive and biological approaches. A similarity between these approaches is that they both have useful applications that can be used to improve people's lives. The biological approach has led to many forms of treatment for mental disorders, such as drug therapy and psychosurgery. And similarly, the positive psychology has been applied to a range of different settings, such as schools, the armed forces, and the workplace, in order to help individuals, organisations and communities to flourish. So first of all, we don't have an introduction to either of the approaches, and we don't have any evidence, do we? They're just telling us facts here. They're not telling us anything else. A major difference between the two approaches is that they are on opposing sides of the determinism versus free will debate. The biological approach supports the determinism side of the debate. For example, research has shown localization of brain functions where certain areas of the brain are responsible for different functions. In contrast, the positive approach proposes the idea of free will, claiming that we are free to choose how we live our lives and have the power to change what we are not happy with. In the positive approach, quality of life therapy is based on free will and the belief that we can improve the quality of our lives. Now, that paragraph is slightly better because they go into more depth. They bring in that quality of life therapy and they link it back to free will. But let's have a look at this conclusion. In conclusion, the biological and positive approaches have some things in common, such as their ability to provide therapies that can be used to treat a range of disorders or to improve people's lives. The difference between them is in terms of where they stand on the determinism versus free will debate. We haven't really come to a conclusion there. So are they too different? Are they similar? You know, what does the writer of this essay think? Also, I've just noticed that this says 20 marks. That's incorrect. Okay, 12-mark question. Yeah, don't panic at that 20 marks. So hopefully you can see here there's a lack of an introduction, there's a lack of depth within, you know, having that evidence, and there's a lack of a conclusion. It's not come to a finish. There isn't an end point. They're just stating what they've already said again. And that's why this one would be slightly weaker. This one, loads more detail. You can see that just by looking at it. Whereas this one, much, much weaker. Okay, so this is the planning sheet that I use with my students. Similarities and differences between approaches. Question, I mean, you can decide. You could do a planning sheet for all the possible combinations if you wanted to, and really briefly plan and sort of summarise what you would say. But these are a really, really useful tool in just allowing you in your mind and on paper to picture and view what you're going to discuss. Okay, so it's got introduction, place for both the approaches here, similarity, explanation and evidence, difference, explanation and evidence, and a box for your conclusion. And you know, they are only small boxes, but it just means that you're brief so that you can then really elaborate when you come to write the answer up. So they'll be available to print off if you want to use them. A really interesting way of starting to look at the revision of this is by creating a table to compile all of your knowledge of the different approaches. So this is an example that I've taken from one of my students. So what we did was we wrote all the different approaches along the side, so biological, psychodynamic, cognitive, behaviourist, positive, and then we wrote all possible areas that we could discuss in a comparison question. So ethics, therapy, determinism, free will, nature, nurture, holism, reductionism, methodologies, objective, subjective, the sample, is it old or new, etc. And then what we did is we thought about each one. So what are the ethics of the biological approach? Well, the study, Rain couldn't get valid consent. Therapy, we looked at a placebo and the fact that it could be deception. And we just had a little think about elements of the course that you could put in each section. So then we went down, right, therapy application. Does drug therapy have a practical application to help people? Well, yes, it does, because it helps people with mental illnesses such as OCD. And we went down each of the headings for each approach, and it ended up having this really, really clear table where you can see, right, okay, so psychodynamic and biological and psychodynamic approaches could be quite objective, or positive approach and behaviourist approach, they could also be a bit subjective. So you're able to sort of identify similarities and the differences. So we've got deterministic, but the positive approach says free will. Well, that's a really, really clear difference, isn't it, between all of the approaches right in front of you. So this is something that I would really, really recommend you doing as part of your revision. It doesn't take that long. It really, really allows you to think about it, and you can use your notes to really come up with a revision resource that can then help you fill out the essay plan. Okay, so that's just a suggestion. That's how we do it in my lessons, and it seems to really, really work and help the students when creating comparison questions. Okay, so that was a brief overview of comparison of the approaches, and I hope that there's been some tips and hints in there on how to tackle comparison questions. Next week, we're going to look at some exam technique, how to push yourself for those top marks. I'm going to focus the session on the classic studies, but I also will bring in some other questions. We might have a little look at some assumptions and some therapies as well. So exam technique will be our next session, and I hope to see you there. I'm just going to stay on for a minute in case there are any questions. Please be reminded that this will be available on the Carlin Cymru drop down of the e-sgol website, and also the PowerPoint will also be available there, in which you can download the resources and print them out to help aid your revision.